The morning of December 11th, 1941, dawned cold and uncertain across the cities of Europe. The echoes of Pearl Harbor still rolled across the Atlantic, and the world held its breath. In Berlin, inside the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler stood before a sea of rigid faces, his voice trembling with the familiar mix of rage and conviction. On that day, he declared war on the United States of America, sealing a fate he could neither foresee nor control. The decision, wrapped in arrogance and delusion, would set in motion the collapse of his empire. Across the ocean, the news reached the streets of New York, Boston, and Chicago. In homes and factories, Americans listened to the radio in disbelief. War had come again, and now it was total. In a small steel mill town in Pennsylvania, a 22-year-old worker named Thomas Caldwell tightened his grip on a newspaper, trembling in his hands. The headline read, "Germany declares war on the United States." He had never seen Europe, never spoken a word of German, but he knew in that instant that his life would change forever. As church bells rang and recruiters opened their doors, the machinery of destiny began to turn. On that single day, history took a new shape. Hitler had cast his final die. He had awakened a sleeping giant, one that would march across oceans and continents, reshaping the world and ensuring that tyranny would not stand unchallenged. For men like Thomas Caldwell, it marked the beginning of a journey through fire and steel, one that would test his faith, his courage, and the very meaning of freedom itself. For Thomas, life before the war had been simple, bound to the rhythm of iron and coal. He had grown up during the Great Depression, in a house where the walls were thin and hope was rationed like sugar. His father, a veteran of the First World War, walked with a limp and spoke little of the trenches of France. "War takes more than it gives," he often said. Thomas had believed him until that December morning. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shaken the nation, but Hitler's declaration felt like a personal challenge. It was as if a dark voice across the ocean had dared every American heart to rise. Thomas's father stood silent by the radio, eyes fixed on the crackling voice that spoke of alliances, of duty, of retribution. "You will go," he said quietly, "and you will see what I saw. But maybe this time, it will end differently." Within weeks, Thomas enlisted. The uniform felt heavy, not only from the weight of the fabric, but from the legacy it carried. As he boarded a train bound for Fort Benning, he looked back at his mother waving through the misted window, her face pale but proud. He realized then that every generation inherits its trial. The war was no longer a story told by old men. It was his turn now. Across the Atlantic, in the corridors of Berlin, Hitler's aides celebrated what they called a necessary act of solidarity with Japan. They believed America to be soft, unprepared, a land of indulgence. None could see the storm that had just been awakened. In that reversal of arrogance and resolve, the destinies of millions intertwined. The German Führer had invited the one enemy capable of ending him. For Thomas Caldwell and countless others, that invitation would demand everything they had to give. By December 1941, Europe was already bleeding. France lay in ruin, Britain stood defiant but battered, and the Soviet Union was enduring the unimaginable on its eastern front. The Wehrmacht had swept across continents, seizing cities with mechanical precision, its banners draped over cathedrals and courthouses alike. Yet behind the facade of invincibility, cracks had begun to appear. Adolf Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States was born not of necessity, but of hubris. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had drawn America into conflict with the Axis indirectly, but Germany's declaration made it official. Hitler, believing in his own destiny, underestimated the industrial and spiritual strength of the United States. He imagined a divided, isolationist country incapable of sustained war. Instead, he awakened an industrial colossus, a nation united in outrage and purpose. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress with measured resolve. "The forces endeavoring to enslave the entire world," he said, "now include the German and Italian governments." Congress responded with near unanimity. The United States was now at war with Germany, Italy, and Japan, a global conflict that would stretch across every ocean and continent. Factories that once built cars began producing tanks and bombers. Women filled the assembly lines as their husbands and sons enlisted. In England, American troops began arriving in waves, their presence a promise that the tide would turn. The arsenal of democracy roared to life. Meanwhile, inside the Reich, the illusion of inevitable victory persisted. Hitler's generals whispered doubts, but his will remained law. The Eastern Front was swallowing divisions whole, the winter freezing both man and machine. Yet propaganda painted triumph in every newspaper, convincing the German people that their destiny was still certain. For soldiers like Thomas Caldwell, training became transformation, from civilian to warrior, from observer to participant in history. He learned to handle a rifle, to read a map, to march in silence through snow and mud. The United States Army was no longer a defensive force, it was preparing for invasion, for liberation, for revenge. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike any before. Two visions of the world, one born of tyranny, the other of freedom, were now on a collision course, and all because one man, in a fit of pride and miscalculation, declared war on a nation he neither understood nor feared enough. The first months of training at Fort Benning stripped away the softness of civilian life. Thomas rose before dawn, his breath visible in the cold Georgia air. The whistle's cry meant movement, sweat, exhaustion, and repetition. He learned to crawl through mud, to sleep on the ground, to obey instantly and without question. Yet beneath the discipline grew something unexpected, a brotherhood. He met men from every corner of America, farmers from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, teachers and miners. They were bound by the same uncertainty, the same longing to prove themselves worthy of the moment. At night, under the dim light of a single lantern, they spoke of home, of sweethearts, of what they might face overseas. Some feared death, others feared returning unchanged. The mail brought both comfort and sorrow. Letters smelled faintly of perfume or coal dust. They carried the warmth of a familiar hand, reminders of the world they were fighting for. Occasionally, news of a fallen friend from another unit spread through the camp, silencing laughter for days. War was still distant, but its shadow had already crossed the ocean. In England, months later, Thomas stepped off a transport ship onto a grey, rain-soaked dock. The air smelled of salt and smoke. Villagers watched from behind fences as endless lines of American soldiers marched through narrow streets. Children waved flags. Women offered tea. To the weary men, this foreign kindness felt almost sacred. Training intensified. They studied German tactics, learned to navigate bombed-out landscapes, and rehearsed amphibious assaults. The rumors of an eventual invasion of France spread like whispers in the wind. Every man knew it was coming, though none knew when. Evenings were filled with the sound of aircraft overhead, British bombers heading east, returning hours later with engines limping and wings scarred. Thomas often stood in the dark, watching the faint glow on the horizon, realizing that every light in the sky represented a life suspended between fate and courage. Despite exhaustion, morale remained high. The camaraderie among the soldiers was unbreakable. They shared cigarettes, rations, laughter, and fear in equal measure. Thomas became a squad leader, responsible for men barely younger than himself. He carried their hopes as he would carry a rifle, carefully, with steady hands. Each day he wrote to his mother, though his words grew fewer as the warcep's reality deepened. "We are ready," he wrote once, "and we will not fail." Then came the day they all waited for, the invasion of Normandy. The world seemed to hold its breath once again. On June 6, 1944, Thomas and his unit landed on Omaha Beach. The sea churned red beneath the waves. Bullets tore through the air like wasps. The screams of men and the roar of artillery created a chaos that no amount of training could prepare them for. He pressed himself against the cold sand, heart pounding, as the cliffs above spat fire and death. Fear became a living thing crawling under his skin, whispering of hopelessness. Yet within that fear came a deeper resolve. He remembered his father's words, "War takes more than it gives," and realized their meaning. It took comfort, innocence, and certainty. But it also gave something powerful, clarity. Hours passed like years. Inch by inch they moved forward, driven not by orders but by survival. When he finally reached the base of the cliffs, he turned to see the beach littered with bodies. The price of freedom was no longer abstract. It was carved into the sand. In the weeks that followed, Thomas fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, through villages reduced to ashes. The German soldiers they encountered were young, frightened, and human. The propaganda that had painted them as monsters now dissolved in the shared horror of battle. War stripped away ideology until only endurance remained. He learned to carry loss as naturally as he carried his rifle. Friends fell. New recruits arrived to fill the gaps. Through it all, he changed, his laughter quieter, his gaze older, yet something inside him refused to die. A belief that if he could endure this, if they all could, then the world might yet be made whole again. By April 1945, the Reich was crumbling. Berlin burned beneath the thunder of Soviet artillery. The once mighty German army was retreating on every front. In the West, American forces pressed deeper into the heart of Germany, liberating camps that revealed the true horror of what had been fought for. Thomas entered one such camp near Dachau. The silence struck harder than any explosion. Rows of skeletal figures stared from behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and uncertain. The stench of death lingered in the air, impossible to escape. He understood then what victory truly meant, not glory, not pride, but release from a nightmare too vast for words. Days later, when news arrived that Hitler was dead and Germany had surrendered, Thomas felt no joy, only exhaustion. The men around him wept, laughed, shouted, or stared in silence. The war that had consumed the world was over, yet its echo would never fade. In the ruins of Europe, the seeds of renewal waited to be planted. For now, there was only the stillness of the aftermath, and the faint hum of trucks carrying the living away from the dead. When Thomas finally returned to Pennsylvania, the town seemed smaller. The same mill chimneys stood against the sky, the same streets echoed with the sound of factory whistles, but everything felt changed. The air was lighter, yet he carried a heaviness inside him that no one could see. His mother met him at the station, her eyes filled with tears she had promised herself not to shed. His father, older and frailer now, shook his hand instead of embracing him. In that quiet gesture, Thomas understood some emotions were too deep for words. The town celebrated its heroes, parades filled the streets, bands played, and children waved flags. Yet among the cheers, Thomas noticed the silence between songs, the faces of mothers whose sons had not returned. He felt the weight of the empty chairs, the unspoken grief hidden behind smiles. He tried to return to work at the mill, but the noise of the machines felt foreign. The rhythm that had once guided his life now clashed with the memories that haunted him. At night he dreamt of Normandy, of the faces of those he had lost, of the cries that would never fade. Months passed before he found peace in small acts. The planting of a tree, the laughter of his niece, the quiet of a morning untouched by sirens. He began to write his experiences, not for others, but to understand them himself. The world had changed too. America stood as a new superpower, and Germany, once consumed by darkness, lay divided and humbled. The decisions made on that December day had reshaped humanity. Thomas would often sit on his porch, watching the sunset, remembering that moment in history when arrogance had met consequence. He did not hate his enemies. He pitied them. They had followed a man who believed he could defy the moral laws of the universe and lost everything. History remembers December 11th, 1941, as the day Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. But for the millions who lived through the years that followed, it was the day destiny shifted. The hubris of one man summoned the might of a nation that believed in liberty, justice, and the sanctity of human life. Thomas Caldwell lived to see a world rebuilt from the ashes, yet he never forgot the lesson of that day, that evil, no matter how powerful, contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The same arrogance that had driven Hitler to declare war had sealed his doom. In the quiet of his later years, Thomas would tell his grandchildren that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it, that freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility, and that history, in its cruel wisdom, always balances the scales in time. The day Hitler declared war on America was the day his empire began to die. From that moment forward, the course of the world turned toward justice, though through suffering and sacrifice. It was the day when darkness challenged light, and light, slow but unyielding, began its return.